Chapter 11. Lean into confusion. So, the first section, this is not in the audiobook, it's only on the book. There is a picture that the author wishes us to look at, and she asks us to make sense of it. And I'm looking at it right now, and what's interesting about it, I mean, I'll be honest, I read the full section, and I did the test, but I didn't record myself talking about my thought process. So I'll kind of uh, I'll kind of tell you how that went about. Sorry, it's not live, but anyways, I was like, okay, so I'm looking at this picture. Looks like there's a hill. There's two raccoons, but there's something really weird on the right, and it's looks like there's a fly and there's like a rock that's like suspended in midair, and it just it's weird. It looks really weird. Like, what is this? And I was trying to think about it. Like, what could this be? What is this rock? Is it photoshopped? That's what I was thinking. Is it photoshopped? Like, no, this book wouldn't have something as silly as something photoshopped. So this is like a genuine picture. I was like, okay, this is a genuine picture. And I looked at it and I was like, what's going on here? It's suspended. What's suspending it? What is this? Is this a prop? Is this something? And to be frank, I was like, I can't figure it out. I really couldn't. So then I read the next paragraph, and it's like, then you notice like there's like a white line under the rock, and I was like, okay. So I go back to it and I zoom up the picture because I didn't have it completely zoomed up. I'm like, oh shoot, okay, yeah. So there's a white line. Okay, and then I was like, is it hanging or not? Um, and is it like hanging from something? Is this a string? What like? But it's wrapped around the the side. I'm like, it doesn't seem like that would be the case either. So I still wasn't satisfied with it. And then I read the paragraph where Julia goes. She says, then suddenly everything clicks into place. That's not the sky. It's water, reflecting the sky. The rock isn't suspended in midair. It's poking up out of the water, and we're not looking up the hill at the raccoons. We're looking down at them. So I was trying to figure it out, and perhaps I didn't give myself enough time. But at the same, in that same respect, it still threw me for a loop, and I was like, gosh, I don't know. Like, what is this? You know. Um, so, darn. But it's okay. You know. Anyways, moving on to the audio section. One small little side note. This kind of going back to the picture, it really reminds me of kind of like the scary story where you realize, oh shoot, you know, what I was thinking was not what the reality was all along, and it's really trippy. So I wanted to kind of point that out. There's a connection here with bias. Anyways, though, so moving on to the next section that I went over, um, there's mention of how a lot of people they will explain away things that don't fit into their worldview by dismissing it. So if I really did look at this picture and I was like, well, that's the sky, and this rock is just in the air, I would have probably like I knew there was something off about it, and I didn't know I couldn't figure it out. I really couldn't. Um, but when you do figure it out, you're like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. But this section is really about, the dangers of that. It's like you see something and it's obviously real. What do you make of it? What do you make of it when you actually come to grips with reality that what you're seeing is not can't be explained by you know logic, and you're like, oh well, blah blah blah. Um, so it's really interesting. Um, she mentions that um, back in World War II, there was an order placed for the Japanese Americans to be put into internment camps, and there was really no reason behind um, doing that because there was no conspiracy, there was no resurgence or anything going on, and yeah, it's about kind of like understanding like why our minds do that, and this is something that I think I need because obviously this puzzle was something that I wasn't able to kind of figure out. I relented or I conceded to being like I really don't know what it is. What is this kind of thing? And got the answer. Um, but and I don't even know if that's the right if that's a scout mindset thing or if I had to go through it more, be like, oh wait, no, I gotta figure it out. But yeah, no, it's interesting. So let's see what this is all about. Next part says the puzzle of the peacock's tail. Ooh, okay, so that's the puzzle of the peacock's tail. So this was referenced, I believe, in the first chapter in the introduction. Why did a peacock's tail make Charles Darwin, sick? And it's because, yeah, the peacock's tail was, it went against his theory of evolution. It seemed like it, at least, because it's like this tail is like so big, it can go up to 5 feet. It can be up to 5 feet, in height, and it weighed the bird down, and it was just very inconvenient. One thing that Charles Darwin did, though, that I think was really interesting is that every time that he came across an idea or an idea that went against his thesis or maybe his opinion, he would make a note of it without fail. He would make a note of it because it stood out to him. And when he did make that note, he would puzzle over it and he would think about it and be like, okay, so why doesn't this work? Why doesn't this work? Or wait, how does it work? How does it work? Just like the raccoon picture that I was talking about earlier. And he would go really into it, and it made him sick, before he realized the truth. And that picture kind of does the same thing, the raccoon picture, because it's like, what the heck is going on here? And then when you figure it out, it's like, oh, okay. And for Charles Darwin, that realization was like the peacock's tail, it had nothing to do with survival mechanism, but reproduction value or reproduction ism. I just made that up right now. But it's this idea that, yeah, no, it's genetics. The traits that were passed down did help with its survival, because if you can reproduce faster than you can die, then the peacock's tail does actually work out to be, much more useful, and it helps somebody survive, or it helps these birds survive. So, very interesting. uh, Need to make a reference note to this. There, see what happens when you try to be logical? People die. The way that was read was great. Not only that, but this next section, the unexpected alien attack, is another Star Trek kind of reference. And I love these references because, I don't know, maybe it can be a little quirky or whatever, but I think people all have their own, hobbies and quirks, and it's great to see some personality, thrown into this. Like, we can obviously see that Julia, is a Star Trek fan, and she's using these things, and it's great because I feel like I don't know, it hits harder. The idea hits harder when you can relate to things emotionally. And obviously, if you love something, like for me, it could be an anime series or whatever. When you write about it, you can't help but infuse that emotion into your writing, and I could see it here. It's great, but that's meta because here's the thing: there is a trend here that I'm seeing about Spock. Whenever Spock is brought up, he's being very quote unquote logical, but because he's logical, and this is what's Star Trek is getting at. It's pretty clear is that logic is not going to save the day. As logical as you can be, they're almost making fun of the fact that, yeah, when you're logical, look what happens, people die. And it's true, actually. You can't base judgment over logic, because if you're in a game and if you're playing in a game where logic is not used by the people around you or the enemies around you, then logic is not the way to play the game. So, as logical as we may be as people, and as intellectual as we can be as people, we have to understand the emotional side of the world. And it works hand in hand, like being logical and being emotional. If you pair those two things together, then you can have a really good understanding of the world, and you can really make the world, your world at least, something that fits your fancy. Really, really. We have to understand both sides. So, anyways, that was really funny. I'm in the middle of this, but I gotta keep going. So, continuing on. So, finishing with the Spock kind of, the Spock story here. And not getting too into detail with the actual alien attack and whatnot, I'll put it this way. Whenever somebody tells Spock, like, Spock, you're wrong, he'll be like, well, it was unpredictable, or, oh, well, that was illogical of them. And there's this idea that Julia is kind of bringing up, which is, well, okay, like, no, like, don't just try to explain it away. Lean into the confusion, be like, wait, what am I missing? What's going on? Like, there's something here that I don't get. What is it? What is it? What is it? And then pursue that with questioning, because maybe there is something you're missing. If you think you're infallible, then you can't really update your ability to to make sense of things, and you'll always be wrong because you're never updating, and you're like, well, it should be like this, and blah 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 blah, and that's it. So, yeah, this does tie into the other chapters really well about all of that. Okay, let's keep going. Ooh, we got a few interesting references in this next section. So, the mystery of the irrational negotiator. So, this is fun. This is really fun because we actually get into the idea of negotiation. And I did take the masterclass of Chris Voss, who is the leading FBI negotiator, and I watched his whole course. So this is a pleasant surprise to see this being referenced. And one thing about Chris Voss, this FBI negotiator, is that when you try to negotiate with somebody, you have to try to understand them. You have to really try to understand them in order to negotiate negotiate with them. It's not really about trying to overpower them with emotion or facts or, threatening them or whatever. It's more about trying to understand where they're coming from. And once you're able to make a connection with that, then you are actually able to negotiate. This is also something that I learned from a program from Sam Ovens. So Sam Ovens, his course that I took, it really is also about the same thing. When you're trying to find a client, it's not about talking. It's about listening to them, and it's about understanding who they are as a person. And when you're able to make a connection with somebody, like through that method, then you're able to mention, like, okay, well, this is my program, this is what I offer, and I think that we are a good fit because I understand your situation. Here is what I do. Let me know what you think. Do you have any questions? So there's this thing about understanding people. And what's funny is that back when me and my wife were fighting a lot and we had to learn how to negotiate with each other, I had to learn how to be curious about her position instead of being judgmental or attacking um, her stance, or somehow trying to overpower it. I had to be curious about it. And when she did bring up a good point, if I did concede to it and I was like, you know what, that is a good point, and I understood her, and she knew that she was being understood, then I was able to say, like, I acknowledge that, and I actually think you have a good point. Here's why I think what I think. It would be so much easier for me to talk to my wife and explain and communicate how I felt about a situation or about a thought or an idea, because I was able to really tell her, and this is perhaps a subconscious thing, that I'm not here to attack you. I'm here to gain knowledge. I'm here to understand your point of view, and you have your reasoning. I respect that. I respect your intelligence. Here's what I think. And usually, more times, well, no, it happens all the time. When you show somebody that you respect their intelligence for any kind of negotiation or any disagreement, when you express that you understand where they're coming from, then when you kind of explain what you believe, there's a lot more. The attitude changes. And again, Scout Mindset is all about attitude, right? So it's like the attitude changes, and it's like, oh, well, it's not about if I'm wrong or you're wrong. I just want to know what's really going on. So the mystery of the irrational negotiator kind of explains the idea of, you know, um, what it means to really negotiate with somebody. And somebody who's irrational, sometimes they do have a reason for believing what they believe. And instead of just kind of signing them off as, oh, they're just irrational, to actually lean into that and be like, okay, well, why? 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 Yes, this is something that I can stand by. I feel like I'm getting extra value because I'm starting to see where what the audiobook can't do, and the book is able to do. For example, showing pictures, allowing you to analyze the pictures. The audiobook's not able to go into that territory, and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. So yeah, I got both the Kindle version and I got the audiobook. I'm like, oh, this is good. I'm getting like the full experience, I guess. So the case of the awkward conversation is the next section of this chapter, and this is really good. I think it's interesting to evaluate, why certain things strike us a specific way. For me, my quirk is, so there's kind of like a quirk here that's kind of being explained, is when she's having a conversation with somebody and they say, "Well, this is awkward." Um, in her head, she's like, why would you say that? That's gonna make things worse." For me, it's when somebody says, "I don't mean to offend you, but," or not to be offensive, but when somebody says that to me, I'm kind of like, you are you're putting a target on yourself right away. Why are you doing that? Like, I'm gonna be like, you think that this is going to dispel my aggression towards you? It's not. Now I'm like, oh, okay, like, bring it on. What is it now? Like, okay, it's like somebody going up to someone and saying, like, okay, I have something really bad to tell you, just to let you know, and blah blah blah. For me, I couldn't really understand that, because I was like, why are you going to do that? Why don't you just tell me what it is, and then we can discuss it afterwards? Like, you're setting it up, you're framing something a specific way already, and that almost feels in a weird way manipulative. Like, oh, you think that this is gonna make things less, uh, it make it less, painful or whatever. To me, it actually does the opposite. I'm actually like more angry. I'm like, oh, okay. So you're trying to, for example, like, okay, I'm not trying to be offensive, but for me, that's like, I'm going to be offensive and I'm going to say this, but I'm going to pretend to be nice to you. That's that's how I you know, I take it. But people actually take these things differently. So for Julia's quirk, you know, like, well, this is kind of awkward. I can imagine her same kind of feeling, like, why did you just do that? Like, why, like, and it puts pressure, on her. And also, she mentioned that she believes it's her responsibility to smooth things out in a conversation. So when somebody does that, it kind of just it defeats the purpose, and it seems very illogical. You know, the same exact way that I look at when somebody says, "I don't mean to offend you," but right. Um, and what's interesting is that this happens. I'll mention this. It goes back to a coworker. I was hanging out with a coworker, and she had a wonderful relationship with her boyfriend, and she was saying praises about him every single time, always smiling when his name came up. And I was very curious about that. Really curious. I'm like, you guys never fight? And she's like, no, we never really fight. And for me, I'm like, what? Like, how's this possible? For me, I always found confrontation. I always fought with my 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 wife before we were even married. We would always like, battle each other, or we would, and it wasn't like aggressive or anything. Well, I mean, I guess there are some of those couple fights where it gets pretty intense, but not like super crazy intense, but more just like it got pretty emotional. But this girl, she had a very good relationship, and then I asked her, what is it that you would say makes you guys so happy? And she says, we understand each other's humor. And she said, I think that's the most important thing, is when you understand somebody else's sense of humor. And I really thought about that, because that seemed like something that I would never hear. I've heard many things about what makes a successful relationship. Some are touted or as like really really fundamentals of five core fundamentals of a happy relationship, all that. This was something I've never heard before, and so upon an investigation and thinking about it, I started to realize a few things. you know Everybody has their own sense of humor, and their sense of humor really tells you about who they are as a person. And there have been times where I've hung out with people and they just rub me the wrong way because they're trying to be funny, but it's not funny, right? For me. And like, um, they'll try to say something that makes me laugh, and it's just like it falls flat, or I'm just like, wow, like, okay, like that could it could be taken in so many different ways. And I think that just the idea of the fact that people see things differently, what makes somebody laugh, we usually think like, oh, something that's humorous, it should be universal. Some of the things that I laugh about and that I talk about, like, nobody would laugh at. I'm pretty sure. For me, for example, like, I know there are people who like to watch South Park and stuff like that, Beavis and Butthead, and I can see why it's funny, but that kind of humor is, I mean, it's kind of funny sometimes, but for the most part, it's just not my cup of tea, kind of thing. And I think that when you realize that there's people who think differently than you and that have different emotional, something stimulates their emotions different than you in different ways, then things will be less confusing. But it is very confusing when you find somebody who does something opposite from you, and you think that they're being extremely rude or disrespectful. I used to think the same thing with my wife, and my wife used to think the same thing about me. We come from different backgrounds, I'm Filipino, Asian. I have a mix of Chinese and Italian and Chinese, Italian, Spanish. and Filipino, and I was brought up a specific way. And she is French, British, German, mostly German though, and just a sliver of Mexican, just like I have perhaps like a sliver of Chinese. Um, well, no, I might have a bit of Chinese, not too much, but the same as her with being slightly Mexican. Um, and what's interesting is that uh, when we communicated, we just realized it took us a long time to get to where we are, but we had to kind of adopt. We were completely polar opposites. I'm telling you, like politically, religiously, you know, preferences in style, so different. But I think a part of why we ended up sticking with each other in the end is because, well, one, someone that's a mystery to you and why they act the way they are, you can't help but be curious about why they are how they are. Um, Even our approach to how we looked at work. I was more of the entrepreneur. She was more of the straight laced. No, get a degree. You need to, really be reasonable when it comes to your job career. I was more like, no, I'm gonna throw myself out there. Uh, Completely opposite. But what's funny is that when we started to really merge our thoughts and ideas, and we started to compromise or reconcile, with each other, it changed both of us radically, extremely radically, and I would even say for the better, because now we're both so much more open to other people because we were able to get along with ourselves, and we were polar opposites. So it's really interesting. So that's the case, anyways. Long spiel about this section of the case of the awkward conversation. Very interesting, though. This next section goes straight into the idea that I was talking about just earlier, the mystery of the homeopathic hospital. And basically, it was kind of like there was an introduction to a method to cure a disease, and this method was very unscientific, you know. It's like basically just like dilute the medicine until like it's not even like potent anymore, but it's almost like the I want to say the embryo effect. Sorry, no, it's the placebo. That's it, placebo effect. So it's the placebo effect, basically. But what's funny is that it worked, and it wasn't because it was a placebo. It was because of what you had to do in order to administer the the solution or the medicine, quote unquote. It was through the methods that you actually cured the disease. So the disease could have been cured, and it could have been like people could have made things so much more, could have saved millions of lives if they had asked, wait, so this still does work, but why does it work? Maybe it's not the placebo effect. Maybe there's something else that we're doing. Maybe there's a hidden factor, something that we don't know. A hidden option C that's making this work. It may not be the placebo in and of itself, but how we're administering it, or our modus operandi that we're not following. So it's really about, if something is confusing, it's not just about looking at things black and white, but trying to find underneath the surface, like, no, what is really going on here? What is the root of this? What's funny is that when you do that, like, for example, when me and my spouse would be surprised about our reactions to certain things, we'd be really surprised, like, why do you look at it like this, or why do you treat this like this? You find out there's something way deeper going on, way deeper, and it's not even what you thought it was. Like the initial thing that popped up, the issue, that is just, that's the symptoms, right, of what's of what's the disagreement. But the disagreement in and of itself lies further deep down in one's core. And what's funny is that somebody can be Republican and somebody can be Democratic, but they can still get along. I know it because when you dig deep down, and you really want to know why people believe what they believe, you'll realize that they're not much different than you. They're really not. Um, Same thing with even people who take different religious stances. Religion versus science. Um, it's kind of like I was reading the book Unscripted by M.J. DeMarco just a while ago with my entrepreneur best friend, and now I'm going back to this book. But what's interesting is that I did a cross reference because M.J. DeMarco says that it's funny how in the political game they do open live debate, and we're encouraged to debate, but the spectrum of debate is so narrow, which means you can either choose one side or the other. There's Republican or Democratic, basically. You're either, conservative or liberal, right? Um, the problem with that is that because it's so narrow, you're only discussing 2 points. You're fighting a war that actually you're 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 given the illusion that you have free speech and you can discuss your argument, but you're just picking which water, you're okay. I have to actually look this up here. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to read just this one paragraph. This is in section 6 of chapter 7 of Unscripted, and it just says, this is section 6, media, we're objective in our subjectivity. Noam Chomsky once said, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. No words better describe the script's mouthpiece, the media. From the local news to the national press agencies to internet newspapers to talk radio, the illusion of this tainted water is you pick the flavor. So, this reminded me of the card trick, the little card trick that Julia puts in a few chapters before this one, where you're given the illusion of choice, but whenever you pick a card, the card dealer says, okay, keep it, or okay, put it back in, and that works to their favor and to whatever the magic trick is. You're given the illusion that you have a choice, but there is no choice. Like, you're given the idea that there is freedom, but there's no freedom. And what's funny is that when it's like breaking out of the Matrix. It's like when I was talking to my wife and we were going deeper and deeper into this, we realized like the issue really isn't about some of these issues that are heavy in controversy. It has nothing to deal with us being different people. At our core, we still believe in the same thing. We both are loving human beings, and we're both against hurting other people, and we're both against, we have a lot of similarities, but there's just nuanced things that, we stick onto, we hold onto, and then a political party will give us this, will tell us this is what we represent, and you can construe that to work your way, whether you're conservative or you're liberal, whether you're Republican or Democratic. It's easy to construe that so easily, and then you miss the forest for the trees, and you realize, like, when you're talking to somebody that, wait, we're both on the same page. We both actually want the same thing. There's nuanced ways that we are looking at things, but in the end, we want the same thing. Even with religion and science, what's interesting, there's a lot of ego battle, I think. It's like, my side's better than you, and I know because I've done more research. I've been in this field for such a long time. I'm knowledgeable. I spent years, studying this subject, and it's presented the same way, whether it be, in anything. And this is kind of like an overarching theory of everything, I guess. Not really, but in a way, it's there's this applies to many different things, and I feel like one one link that I see between MJ DeMarco and Julia Galef in their books, and they're completely different books. If you read both books, very, very different. Um, one is extremely sophisticated, and one is not even really that much sophisticated. But there's what's funny is that, but they have hints of each other in um, in the style. So there are times where Julia breaks off from being, extremely scientific, but then she'll throw in something that's very, pop culture, and it's like, oh wow, like, okay, we got Star Trek, or we got this, and then like it's like, whoa, that's interesting. Um, MG DeMarco is kind of the opposite. It's all like pop culture, but then he'll throw some sophisticated words out there, and you're like, oh, wait a second, So it's very interesting, but there's still a link in this idea of like breaking through reality, breaking through the illusion of reality. Sometimes we believe that things are a certain way, but they're not really that way, and you have to question it a little bit further. You got to dig a little deeper. What I love about the duality between these two books is that with Julia, again, I feel like it's a much more scientific approach, or not scientific. I would say it's more from an academics approach, very academic, and then MG DeMarco is more like from, even though he did graduate and he did get a business degree, like he's totally anti, university, and you can tell by his writing that it's not scholarly at all. Both of these get their points across in different ways, in different languages, but the duality in it is it's to me it's humorous because it's like, oh wow, like two different people probably wouldn't, you know, uh, you wouldn't catch them like having coffee with each other or anything, but it's just so interesting that the worldview and their opinions, there's still like this deep rooted kind of desire to search for the truth. And sometimes I feel like the truth, while it's not directly in the middle of something, it lies somewhere in the middle between these two. So going back and forth between them is really interesting. Anyways, though, I believe this is the last section. Oh no, there's still a few more things. So okay, let's keep going. Another connection. Now we're going into paradigm shifts, and what is a paradigm shift? And again, this is something that both books get into. In this section, Julia mentions how paradigm shifts are really, they're gradual changes. Once anomalies are discovered and identified, they are kind of put into, they're tested, and depending on how, how relevant or not relevant, but how powerful that anomaly ends up being in terms of impact, in terms of changing the way the paradigm is. We adjust like micro updates. It's interesting. In contrast, the other book that I'm talking about talks about kind of like it's like, forget the paradigm, you got to throw it out. Like it's complete shit. Like you need to like look at it in a completely different way. And it's funny because again, there's this interest in like, okay, this is what the established foundation is for our beliefs. How do you go about it? Update it a little bit over time, throw it completely out because it's useless, and start a revolution, right? So it's very interesting. And again, I feel like sometimes somewhere in the middle, somewhere, there's that sweet spot, and that's what I'm searching for. Oh, this next section is actually really awesome. It's talking about an LMM, or a pyramid scheme. It's called Anomalies Pile Up and Cause a Paradigm Shift. This is about, a lady who decided to join an LMM, and what ended up happening is that she was promised that this is going to be easy, you're going to make money, things are going to be good for you, and she went into it, and that's not what happened. And there was like more and more hints that were telling her there's something wrong here. And it wasn't until she watched a Netflix video about the cult of Scientology that she was like, oh my gosh, I'm realizing this LMM company that I'm in is exploiting me. And then, she got out of it. And what's interesting about this is that anybody can fall into like this into this kind of position, or kind of fall into this story when they're first starting out. Like for me, again, I started my channel back in 2008, I believe, or was it 2008? The end of 2008. And at that time I was reading Napoleon Hill, and this is something that you can actually even look back at I think it was like a 13-minute video, my first video, where it was just a black screen. But what was funny about it was that, like, I was like, okay, yeah, there's The Secret. I mentioned The Secret, and I mentioned Napoleon Hill and stuff like that. I'm pretty sure I mentioned Napoleon Hill. And then, you watch YouTube videos like CoffeeZilla. Yeah, I'm putting in like YouTube in this, but more it's meta because I'm like this small little blip on YouTube, but like with CoffeeZilla, with him, he exposed Napoleon Hill, and Napoleon Hill was actually kind of a fraud, and there were a lot of things that he claimed that were not true. And me and my entrepreneur friends, we wanted to be successful, extremely successful. Back in 2010, we did a lot of entrepreneurial kind of like ventures. Some of them yielded okay results. Some were abandoned. Some are things that we're still continuing up until this day. But what's interesting is that when you saturate yourself with so much ideas of success, even that, you have to be careful about what is success, because there's a lot of people who will exploit you because they're like, oh, you want to be a millionaire, oh, you want to be successful, okay, well, here. And the truth about the world is that, yeah, there are people, everybody has their own agenda in a way. They have their own thing that makes them happy in life. That's the truth. Everybody has a reason for doing what they're doing. My reason for doing this deep dive, for example, the reason why I've got the friends that I have, reason why I married the wife that I married. There's reasons behind all of that. There's reasons behind why my friend did what he did. And in terms of entrepreneurship, there's a reason why this author did what she did writing this book. Going back to the whole idea of me reading this book, I said it already in the introduction, is that I want to understand how to be a better, how to make better judgment calls. That's the reason why I'm looking into this book, and I feel like it hasn't been addressed enough. And for me, what I believe is a very core thing about being successful is asking the right questions. And not just, that's only half of it. Because you can ask the right questions, but if you don't process the answer a specific way, then it may fall on deaf ears, even if it's really good. So Tony Robbins said, it's all about asking. When you get excellent questions, when you ask excellent questions, you receive excellent answers. And what's funny about even, me talking about Tony Robbins or Les Brown or Zig Ziglar or Kenneth Blanchard or Bishop T.D. Jakes, there's all these people that I've really, really did heavy research into, listened to a lot of their audiobooks, spent hours and hours listening to them, even listening to the New Testament, just one book, the book of Matthew. I listened to that many times. Sermon of the Mount was my favorite chapter. Like, you listen to all these, you saturate yourself with all these ideas of success, and you may realize that sometimes these people who, have given you these ideas, like Napoleon Hill, maybe they're a fraudster or whatever, and then you have to be like, oh, really? And I'm not saying any of these people that I'm talking about are fraudsters, but the more you listen to them, you start realizing that success does leave clues behind. There's a lot of clues, and it's about understanding what questions to ask. It's about understanding what, uh, again, how to process it. And in this case, talking about, questions, and talking about the ability to break out of a cult, right? Going back to this section, there's this idea of sometimes when you're deep into something, and I was really deep into the self-help or quote-unquote entrepreneurial or success or being a millionaire kind of, I was all into that before. I still do actually look up success. I mean, obviously what I'm doing now is about success. It correlates completely. That's my obsession, I guess, is like, what is like success? And that's why Successful Thinker is like, it's not just me being a successful thinker, but it's me thinking about what it means to be successful, right? So it's that's what's interesting about it. And then for me, I've had to continuously kind of like test things, and you go into, when you get into this kind of thing, you are aware. I did go to an Amway meeting, and then like I just needed to go to one to be like, no, sorry, I'm out, kind of thing. But Amway was also an MLM, and you have to really question things. You really do. But sometimes you have to still go into that trench, and you gotta saturate yourself, and you have to be, it's like what she explains here, the skill about, really testing your paradigm. She says, it's a tricky skill. It forces you to act without clarity, to operate under one paradigm while being aware of its flaws and inconsistencies, knowing that it might be wrong and that you might end up abandoning it. You have to resist the temptation to resolve inconsistency prematurely by forcing all of your observations into one paradigm, and instead be willing to remain confused for days, weeks, or even years. And that's a perfect way to close this section off. Moving on. That's funny. Be willing to stay confused is the last section here, and this one's a good one as well, because it talks about a Christian pastor's son that wrote a book, and then what ended up happening is that this book became really popular, but then a lot of people said, you know what, we read your book, but it screwed up our life. And now the person who wrote it is like, I kind of have to, think about what I did. Somebody asked him, like, okay, so are you going to disavow your book? And he's like, well, I just need, quote unquote, I just need to listen to where people are before I come out with my own thoughts. So he's kind of, at least here in this book, where we leave him off, he's kind of suspended in confusion. And it's okay to be, suspended into confusion, The last quote of this chapter is, as Isaac Asimov repeatedly said, the most exciting phrase to hear in science is not eureka, but that's funny. That is. It's very interesting. That's funny. Like, that's peculiar. That's interesting. For me, my author friend jokes all the time ever since he's known me. Whenever I say interesting, I always like a part of it is because I love the Japanese word for interesting, omoshiroi. Omoshiroi. It sounds interesting. Omoshiroi yo ne. Like, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Uh, and I'm always curious about things that are interesting. Sometimes I, you know, have ideas, I posit theories and stuff, and I see how things go, and, you know, I try to find out, like, okay, well, what's going to happen? What's the end result? You know, and I love it when things strike me as funny, because it's. Mm, I have to say, when you feel like you know everything, and there was a point in my life where I thought I did know everything, things seem very boring, and people just seem like really stupid, and it gets and what's funny is that you realize at a certain point, especially if you come to the conclusion that, wait a second, it's not that I know everything. It's that there's so much that I don't know. There's so much that I don't know. And it's actually more fun. It's more adventurous when you don't know things and you explore, you discover. Scout mindset is interesting for me. The name Scout is actually interesting because I'm an Eagle Scout. I was an Eagle Scout. Am I guess you never really lose it. And it's interesting because when I look back on my past, I think about all those things that I did when I was in scouting, and it was really all about exploration. Sometimes people think about scouts and they think about, like, what they hear in the news, maybe things that the terrible scoutmaster has done. And maybe I'm lucky because you hear a lot of that in terms of what happens with the Catholic Church as well. Like, oh, there was a corrupt priest. Same thing with scouting. It's interesting. Funny enough for me, like, I never, I may just be lucky. I never experienced, anything like that. There were times where sometimes I would be like, huh, you know, a little wary, because obviously I was aware of, where I was in. So I'd be wary about, like, okay, like, are things a certain way? But yeah, no suspicions, no suspicions. Despite, being wary of things, nothing happened. Maybe nothing happened because I was wary, so maybe it could be that as well. But it's interesting. It's interesting. In the end, when I think about this idea, this word scout, um, it stands. I have great memories, with scouting, and it taught me how to be a much more. It changed my life. It did. I used to be very shy. I used to not. I didn't consider myself a leader. Um, Back when I was younger, and scouting changed that. It really did. So, anyways, we'll leave it. We'll leave it at that for today, and we'll see where this goes. We'll see where this goes. I hope everybody here that's listening to this is enjoying, the thoughts and ideas that I'm putting out there. I hope it's of use, that it sparks some intellectual kind of like thought or ideas. But anyways, though, yeah. Have a good one, you guys, and I'll see you next time.